Welcome everybody to the latest Trimarc webcast. My name is Danny Akoski. I do a lot here. I do a lot of stuff. It's not even bothered telling you what my title is. But I am joined by Brandon Colley and Scott Blake. Welcome to 10 ways, plus probably a few more that we came up with to secure your Entra ID tenant, Azure AD, which we take the position that as long as Microsoft has not changed all their documentation, we will call it Azure AD. But I am slowly easing us in to call it Entra. Whatever it is, it's the clouds, and the clouds are tough. And of course, right when I start speaking, fire engines go by, because that's the way the days go on a Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? Thursday? Welcome, everybody. We have 97 people in here already. This is awesome. This tells us we knew right from the beginning that this was going to be a huge one, because there's not really a whole lot out there, especially like cloud. I remember if you even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, if you even mentioned moving things to cloud, people would whack you with their on-prem stick and say, we're not doing that, too dangerous, we're not doing that, we're not ready for that. Cloud's a fad, right? Cloud's never gonna pick up. But 10 years later, I've been in this for 10, 15 years, and now it's everywhere. And that's what we do here. We are a Trimarc. We do Active Directory, on-prem, and Azure AD, Entra ID, as well as VMware vSphere. We do the assessments. That's what we do. We're the experts at that. And I am going to be done talking pretty much right now. We have a whole bunch of links and stuff to talk about at the very end, where you get all of our content, where you can sign up for new webcasts. But I want to get to this. This is the important thing. I am joined by our Director of Services, Scott Blake, and one of our Ultra Grand Poobah Senior Consultants, Brandon Colley. Between these two, these young-looking bucks, these fresh-faced babies, 30-plus years of experience between these two guys, which is why you're no longer going to hear me talk. I'm giving it to them. Boys, take it away.
Wow, Danny, that was a great introduction, baby-faced. I was a little bit more baby-faced about a week and a half ago when this was all freshly shaven, and didn't think it'd be as professional to be on cam with the hat on like I usually feel more comfortable on. So take me as I am. So I am Brandon. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. I'm going to kind of kick us off a little bit and explain a little about where we're going to go with today's topic. So challenges in Entra ID are, and as we kind of say with the title and a little tongue in cheek, is they're the same but also different as on-prem. And so we're going to focus on kind of what we're theming as the three pillars. And by this, we're talking about the mindsets used to secure your on-prem Active Directory. A lot of those mindsets can be the same when you start thinking about Entra. So for today's webinar, we're going to first focus on finding and protecting privileged assets, and Scott's going to cover that first section for us. And then followed by that, I'll go ahead and I'll be covering some of the implementation of secure policies, followed by the always popular concept of insecure defaults when talking about Microsoft configurations or misconfigurations. How about? Along the way, we'll be counting down those 10 methods that you can use to protect your Entra ID. So Scott, why don't you get us going on privileged assets?
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Happy to get things started here. So with privileged assets, our first challenge is really identifying and protecting, these ultra critical, accounts, groups, applications that exist in your environments. And the definition we'll use for privilege is, a user group, role, or application with effective administrative rights to the platform, the ability to elevate to administrative rights, or having outsized rights, to a large amount of data. Maybe you don't need to be a full admin, maybe you just need to have access to a file share, for instance. I'll start off by taking you through the privileged objects that exist in Active Directory and touch on some key protections for on-prem, and then I'll shift focus to Entra ID's privileged objects and what you can and should implement to safeguard, these highly critical resources in your environments. All right, so on-prem, what's privileged, right? When it comes to AD, we try to break things down to simplify and assist with identification. So we essentially have three different categories here. First up is the highly privileged built-in groups, the groups that Microsoft provides out of the box with their associated permissions. We have the well-known ones like domain admins and administrators, as well as some of the lesser-known ones like DNS admins and PKI admins that will probably become more and more important as additional research is done around them. From there, we have integration components. So these are applications and services that tie directly into AD that could also be used to exploit Active Directory as well. We, at Trimarc during our assessments, we see a lot of security issues around these integrated products, but that's not to say they can't be secured. You really just need to be aware of what the abilities for these components have within Active Directory, and then really who has rights to manage these systems. With custom delegation, here's where things can get really tricky because custom delegation can be so many different things. For us, it typically consists of a custom created group with elevated rights within AD to perform a specific function. And I've given a few examples here on the list that we see, day to day during our engagements. And really, the other thing too with custom delegations is it can get expansive quickly. There are quite a few security permissions you need to be aware of and concerned with when looking at custom delegation. So here I'm highlighting probably the 6 most permissive security access control entries that we typically see and flag during our assessments, but these are by no stretch the only ones you need to be concerned with. So really, in summary, you can see from these 3 categories that there are a lot of things within AD that should be considered privileged and can probably imagine all the challenges around identifying and securing these assets you're going to have within your forest. But hope is not lost, and we here at Trimarc certainly haven't given up yet. So the Trimarc team has spent a lot of time and shared a lot of great information to the community over the years on many of these topics, which I've highlighted here. Each one of these would probably require its own webcast to really dive into each topic to get out all the information you would need. And I did have one half-joking statement I made here about on-prem Exchange, saying that you should get rid of it. But really, that's probably one of the best options when it comes to on-prem Exchange. And if at all possible, just go ahead and fully migrate to Exchange Online. But in addition to these articles, which I highly recommend reading, we have some general best practices when it comes to on-prem privilege protections, which we can touch on now. So, as with most problems, right, the first step is admitting you have a problem, or in this case, identifying how many problems you may have. You must know what is privileged in your environment before you can start protecting anything. And then once you do identify everything, the first question you need to ask yourself is, does this object, this user, this group actually require this level of access? And if it does, then we start moving into these other protections. We here at Trimarc are really big fans of the protected users group because of all the excellent security enhancements it provides. But rarely do we really see it in use. And when we do see it in use, it's very sporadic. A lot of what we see from customers is that we can't use the protected users group because it breaks our administrative process. So our response to that is, if the protected users group breaks administration in your environment, well, you really need to step back and look at how administration is actually being performed. I think one of the most common things that we hear is, hey, we can't put our AD admins in protected users because then they can't log into VMware. Well, there's a really simple answer for that, right, Brandon? It's exactly. Yeah, set up a dedicated account for administering your VMware environment. All right, and then from there, part of protecting privileged accounts includes knowing where they are used. So really, as a general rule of thumb, if a tier 0 account is being used on a system, so one of those highly privileged accounts that we talked about before, that system is now also a tier 0 system. So I'm sorry, you probably have a lot more tier 0 assets in your environment than you would have originally thought, but really this is the only way to control credential theft. And this kind of ties into the next one as well too, the privileged access workstations or PAWS. With these, we almost never see these deployed in environments that we assess, but really this is one of the best things you can do to protect those accounts that are administering your environment. So they are definitely worth the effort. We want to see more and more of them. And yeah, just want to keep pushing this knowledge and information and trying to make this as easy as possible, because some of these items aren't easy. So it's really on us and the security community to make this doable for everyone out there in their organizations. So with all this being said, let's jump over to the cloud to talk about what privileged objects look like there. And they may or may not surprise you. All right, so what's privileged in Entra ID? So shockingly, or not, these are very similar to what we have discussed conceptually from on-prem, with some noteworthy differences. We have your highly privileged default roles provided by Microsoft, just on a much larger scale. And really the ones we're displaying here are only a fraction of the total roles currently available in Entra. And we're going to break these roles down into two different groups. So the bolded roles that we have highlighted here, we define as Trimarc level 0 roles. So very similar to Microsoft old tiering model. We wanted to simplify and highlight the groups that are most privileged and have or could have administrative level access to the platform. And then from there, the roles that are not bolded, that are highlighted now, are still considered privileged, but don't have quite the same level of access. So they're not at administrative level on the platform. We define these as Trimarc level 1 roles. They are still important and may provide indirect paths to compromise the platform or direct paths to important data, if abused. We do categorize roles at Trimarc all the way down to level 4, but we really consider those Trimarc level 0 and level 1 roles to be the most privileged and therefore should have additional safeguards around them. And then jumping into custom delegation, here, basically the same as on-prem, just on a much smaller scale. We don't see a whole lot of custom delegation within Entra ID yet. And I think the main reason for this is that Microsoft has just built so many roles into Entra by default. So really for whatever use case you have, Entra likely already has a role you can leverage that still maintains that concept of least privileged. And I think in most cases, it's safe to say that we would advise using a built-in role over a custom role in most cases. Again, there's always exceptions to the rule, but those are usually easier to track, manage, and follow.
Hey, Scott, I got an audience question if you want to take it.
Oh yeah, as long as it's an easy one.
Why the maybe by application admin?
That's a spoiler alert. We're going to get there, I promise.
Okay, hang tight. Well, he's going to answer it.
All right, and another thing too with custom delegations is that we do have that remnant of nested groups. Thankfully, Microsoft has decided to limit this to 1 level deep. I hope that limit stays, meaning you could have a custom group within a role, but you can't have a custom group within a custom group within a role. So at least it keeps it, that 1 level deep, which should make it a bit easier to track and manage. I will say that we still don't really want to see any of these nested custom groups within any Trimarc level 0 or level 1 role. So any roles on this screen, really, we just want to see direct membership. All right, and then for integration components, we see a couple of carryovers from Active Directory as well as a newcomer, applications and service principals, right? So applications are pretty cool and unique in Entra, as you can give an application and its associated service principal custom rights to Entra and its components. So you can apply these permissions directly to the application based on its needs and use case. So depending on the application or the permissions granted, an application could have highly privileged rights to the tenant. And the 4 permissions here that we have captured, we deemed to be, once again, those Trimarc level 0 permissions. So they basically have effective administrative rights to the platform. So this means that a compromise of an application with this level of access could actually result in a complete compromise of the entire Entra tenant. All right, and here we go.
Now
So
for the
circling back and to answer your question, Danny, if you have Trimarc level 0 applications, the application and cloud application administrator roles are now Trimarc level 0 roles and must be treated as such. And the other important part to mention about this too is that you also need to look at who has owner rights to these privileged applications. And you may not know this, or you may know it. You can actually have more than one owner for an application or group within Entra, which is definitely different than the on-prem side as well. So really, yeah, at what level you would classify application administrator and cloud application administrator directly depends on the permissions associated with your applications. So now that we have identified what may be privileged in Entra ID, let's again pivot over to the defensive side. So once again, no surprise, right? We see similarities in protecting privileged assets when compared to on-prem. But we also have some really cool additional features in Entra that aren't on-prem and probably never will be, unfortunately. So once again, first and foremost, you really have to focus on limiting the number of privilege accounts and privilege applications in the tenant. And remember to check those ownerships as well. Next up is using dedicated on Microsoft accounts for administration. So we recommend that any account that is a member of a tier 0, or sorry, still stuck on old Microsoft, a Trimarc level 0 or a Trimarc level 1 role should be a cloud only on Microsoft account. And the reason we advocate for this is that we don't want to open up the ability for an attacker to compromise your on-prem environment to then compromise your Entra tenant through a synced administrative account. So we want to try to separate those two security boundaries as much as possible. Next up is passwords. Although Brandon might be jumping ahead on me a little bit. I am excited about PIM too, Brandon. Passwords are a problem, right? They continue to be the weakest link in security. So we really want to advocate for passwordless authentication. It's easily one of the coolest features that's available to Entra that sets it apart from on-prem. We love passwordless authentication. So using a smartphone app like MS Authenticator, enabling the Windows Hello feature, or the use of a FIDO2 key really can make your credentials stronger, especially around your vulnerable administrative accounts that are typically the ones that are targeted from an attacker. Next up, and no big surprise, right, is hey, we still want to see those privileged access workstations. Because again, it's about cutting down the risk of admin credential theft. We do recognize that this is a pretty big lift. So we do say in the interim, if you can't get to a full PAL deployment, use a dedicated web browser when accessing the Entra admin portal. So, if your Chrome is your daily driver for surfing the web, use something like Firefox or Edge exclusively for accessing and administering Entra through the portal. And last but not least is another fantastic option available in Entra called Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. This is the just-in-time management solution that I think we've always advocated for on-prem, but never really got. So let's jump into this a little bit more.
Sure. Before we jump over here, I had a question in chat that I wanted to briefly cover.
Oh, yeah. Please.
So there was a question about the user administrator role and why it was not considered one of our highly privileged roles. And so the user administrator does have the ability to change passwords, but not for some of these highly privileged accounts. So members that are in global admins are protected, and as well as anyone who's a member of a role assignable group that's set in that area as well. So user administrator still highly used, also still very important to protect and to keep an eye on, and to probably use PIM. So go ahead and take it away with that, Scott.
No, that was a great question, Brendan. Thank you. All right, so with PIM, we do see PIM quite often. I would probably wager to guess around 90% of our engagements have PIM deployed in their tenant, which is fantastic. But on the flip side, the vast majority of these environments we look at have the majority of their privileged account essentially set to full-time active versus eligible, which I'm going to say completely defeats the purpose of PIM, at least from a security perspective, as I view it. So here in this example, through the screenshots, we see Lee has been correctly assigned eligible rights to the global admin role. On the other side, we have Joni and Brandon have an active assignment with no eligibility. This essentially means they have full-time rights to global administrators. So really, from this example, be a Lee, not a Brandon, which, sorry, Brandon.
I'm the one that did the screenshot, so.
Yeah, it's kind of your fault. As far as which accounts we do recommend being set up for PIM, at a minimum, we want to see, once again, those Trimarc level 0 and level 1 roles set for PIM active for members within it. Granted, there's probably going to be some exceptions. Obviously, you don't want any service accounts to have to PIM up to get the access they need, but really those are few and far between. And the reason PIM is so great is it allows for implementations of additional safeguards before an account can go from being a normal user account to an account with elevated access within the tenant. And this can take form a couple of different ways. So you can actually set it up for management approval. So if Lee wanted to become a global admin, maybe there's a step in there that says, okay, Lee requested access, and manager then has to come in to approve that access before Lee is then granted rights to that role. You can also force re-authentication through MFA as well, just ensure that person is the person you want accessing that account and role. And then another cool thing about it is you can set that role, that access to expire after a designated period of time versus having and not needing full permanent access to that role. And our standard recommendation here is limiting access to 8 hours or less. So every 8 hours, which should just be a normal business day, Lee would essentially have to go through the eligibility process to up again into global administrator. And then there's a couple other cool things too, like the ability to enable notifications so certain individuals can be flagged when somebody does PIM up into a role. And then you can also conduct reviews to see if users are actually leveraging, the roles they've been set up for eligible for. And then if not, that's probably a pretty good indicator that they don't need to have access to that role. And it is also worth mentioning that PIM does require a P2 subscription for all accounts leveraging this feature, but in our minds, it's well worth the cost just because of all the benefits you get from it. And also, I didn't want to say kind of tongue-in-cheek that, welcome to the cloud where everything costs something. So this is just the way it goes here.
You guys want another question?
Yes. What you got, Danny?
Let's go with should companies of all sizes have pause? Is it suitable to use a VM on local machine or in the cloud as PAW rather than extra laptops/hardware?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's definitely not the first time we've been asked it. My take, it's probably a good, better, best, mentality, like where good is, like I was talking to you before about, at the very least having a separate browser for accessing, the admin portal and Entra. Better would be probably a VDI solution. I think the issues we would have around a VDI solution is who has rights to that workstation, right? Because really it's about controlling who can get to that system. And it's probably your VDI admins who would have, the ability to kind of escalate to local admin on that system, which isn't bad. It's just that you then have to take into account, okay, who are your VDI admins, and probably, put in some additional safeguards around those accounts too, just to make sure, that that's not a path to compromise. What do you think, Brennan?
Yeah, I think that was perfectly said. I think we kind of covered the good section too, and especially talking about using pause for Entra as far as just at least use a separate browser, right? That way you're not getting any of that possible contamination from your daily driver browser that you use for your email and such. So that's probably the least intrusive method to do something like that.
Yeah, everyone can at least do that first step, and we understand it does get more complicated from there. But the best recommendation really is that standalone workstation, because then you can really control who has access to it and what admins can actually do on it is the other side as well too. You don't necessarily want them surfing the web on their administrative workstation. All right. So this wraps up our portion on identifying and protecting privileged assets and Entra ID and how it compares with its much older sibling On-Prem AD. While Entra is new, I will say that many of the same concepts applies, but there are some really cool additional features which we touched on a little bit that Microsoft has deployed to enhance the security of these platforms if obviously you use them correctly. But now I will pass it over to Brandon to walk us through policy management.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. I don't know how it's possible that I already feel like I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to do the best I can here. All right, so policy management. And I thought this was a funny picture mostly, and now I'm going to try to fit it into why it makes sense to policy because I think it's fun. But so policies as far as written policies or documented policies is not necessarily what we're talking about here. It's a sign, it's not a cop. And so us as technologists, really when someone says, hey, implement a policy, they're really talking about enforcement. So when talking about your on-prem solutions in the past for policy management, your first one is just going to be group policy, right? So group policy can do tons of things. There's hundreds of different settings that you can configure in there, up into the thousands if you use some of the template add-ons. And so really, that's kind of the biggest on-prem policy management that exists. Firewall is another one. I know some people may argue that firewall is not necessarily a policy, but it definitely can enforce who can talk to who using source and destination. It can also limit by protocol, so therefore kind of limits what applications can occur. If you've got some next-gen firewall stuff, you can do a whole lot more as far as the specific user itself. And then SCCM, that's another on-prem tool. The compliance state that exists in SCCM is a method that we've used in the past to manage policies, as well as the ability to deploy and enforce application updates, as well as the Microsoft patches themselves, kind of enforces the compliance of some of those devices. Now that we've shifted to the cloud, Intune kind of really came on the scene and came out with the intention of ultimately replacing SCCM, at least back when I was an admin 5-10 years ago. Intune was going to replace SCCM, and it obviously has not yet. But it does come with some cool BYOD controls and allows enforcement in combination with some of the conditional access policies. So things like requiring compliance and hybrid joins, the app protection policies, those are all getting a little bit further than I necessarily want to get right now. But that's the type of policies that we're really talking about. And so we're going to really dig into conditional access policies. But before we can really talk about conditional access policies, we need to talk about security defaults. So security defaults, I was surprised when I looked it up. It's been out for 4 years now. So if you're in a situation where you're a small tenant, or you're just not necessarily feel like you're mature enough to graduate into using conditional access, you can implement and should implement security defaults. And so this is where you go to set that up. We've got a link here that we'll share later on as well. That's how you get there, and also some more information about security defaults. The other thing that Microsoft really did almost equally as long ago. So back in late 2021, it came out of a preview feature were templates. And I think we started with 8 templates that were available, maybe even less than that. And as of today, we've got 17, or as of at least last week, there were 17 templates that exist inside of the conditional access space. And these really are perfect for getting started when implementing your conditional access policies. So things like requiring legacy authentication, they're in the top right, things around password self-service and MFA. And we're going to touch on MFA as kind of our first thing. Before we really dig into that, I would need to mention the newest of kind of the new conditional access changes, which is the Microsoft managed tags. And so here is an example of the multi-factor authentication for admins accessing the admin portal. So this is one of a handful that Microsoft has started rolling out. Late last year, they implemented some of these automated rollouts for tenants who, I believe it's rolled out to tenants who they detect in some sort of way. I don't know, we'll throw Copilot in there or something on how they're identifying that you maybe need these policies. But if you see them in your tenant, they're tagged with that Microsoft managed, they're going to come in report only mode, and then they're going to automatically activate after 90 days. The screenshot on the right that I could not make big enough is what you see when you click on one of those, and it's a little different than your traditional policies that are in there, but it does a really good job identifying what the possible impact may be. So take a look at that if you do see those in your tenant. But as far as creating our first like real good policy, right, would be to start with requiring MFA for your admins. So if you haven't already, I would suggest you could start with the template. You could start with your Microsoft managed policy. By default, those are going to tag those first 14 default directory roles. And if you were paying super close attention and took really good notes in Scott's section, you might identify that the 4 roles on the right-hand side, those are not included by default. So I wanted to do this for 2 reasons, where some of these highly privileged roles are not going to be in your MFA for admins if you're using roles to target them. Certainly if you're just following the default configurations for that. The second is a bit of a story on an assessment that I had done last year. We had a tenant who had set MFA for admins and also had set MFA for everyone. However, their everyone was targeting only synchronized accounts, so accounts that had come from their on-prem environment, so your typical user accounts. They were also following kind of our best practice for using cloud-only accounts for administration, but unfortunately, they were only targeting these 14 roles, and they had left several of their administrators to not be required for any sort of MFA whatsoever. So we need to make sure that we're fully covered when we're talking about multi-factor authentication. So kind of the second piece of that is whether you require multi-factor or require authentication strength. So this is a fairly newish addition now. It's an either or situation. So if you haven't looked at your policies for some time, this may be something that's new to you. And so you might be wondering, well, what does strong authentication mean? And so Microsoft breaks it into 3 separate categories. The MFA strength, which is not too much terribly different than just the old MFA requirements. So not a bad choice. Passwordless is starting to get you a little bit more into that fun buzzword that everybody's really talking about. And then phishing resistant even gets you further along the lines to improve upon your MFA. But I noticed when I was looking at this that I've implemented this kind of strong authentication strength. And that's because you can actually create your own custom authentication strength. And you can do that. And I honestly learned about that while I was putting this together. So I've been around, I learned something new every day, and I'm glad I can. So hopefully I can share something new and cool with you all today too. Where if you go through the conditional access policies in the portal, click on protection, authentication methods, the first 3 there are default, the multi-factor, passwordless, and the phishing resistant. You can click on the new authentication strength, and then you can select specifically the preferred authentication combinations that you want to see. So you can create this and you can enforce the specific types of authentication strength that you maybe want for your administrators or a subset of users, and things like that. So you can set many of these. I think the upper bound was 12 to 15 different custom policies that you can create. So that's all I've got for your typical MFA for administrators. But if you really like MFA, then you'll really like that everybody gets MFA, right? You get an MFA and you get an MFA and everybody gets MFA.
Can I get an MFA, Brandon?
You can get MFA. And if I say it again, I'm going to lose my voice. So this is obviously what it's going to look like. You set up require multi-factor for all users, and all users should mean all users, right? Set this to report only mode to identify what kind of impact, because I know I said all users equals all users. There's going to be some service accounts. There's going to be some situations that's not supported for whatever reason. So report only is going to help capture that. Also, then applying to all users with exclusion groups. So that's kind of going to be your best method to get that going, making sure that you have full coverage and that nobody slips through the cracks. What's that, Scott? More MFA. So multi-factor authentication for risky sign-ins. So this is another one that can start in the templates. And perhaps this one should maybe have come before the pushing it to the everyone, but it makes for a good transition for us to start shifting from the MFA discussion into the risky policies, right? So using sign-in risk will unfortunately require that P2 license that Scott had talked about. This is only required for the users that are going to be targeted with this policy. So even if you've only implemented this for some of your subset of administrators or something along those lines, you can still utilize these risk policies on those user objects.
This seems like a good one to target at maybe some of your more important users in the environment too, that aren't necessarily administrators. So maybe your CEOs and top level directors.
Yeah, I think you are correct. That would be a good kind of subset of users to go with. Okay. Riskier. So in addition to sign-in risk, we also have user risk. So to Scott's point about some dangerous sign-ins as far as some of your C-suites or your important users in the environment, maybe you've got administrators or just anyone who likes to use a VPN, forgot to turn it off. All of a sudden your sign-in looks like it's coming from a different country or a different part of the United States. You're outside of your user behavior. Anything like that's going to be more of that sign-in risk. Implementing a user risk policy is going to be more closely related to the breached credentials. So the user itself is going to, in this policy state, going to be required to change that password, because chances are that that password has been compromised, especially if they're in that high level, right? That high user risk level. So as far as policies go, these are the 4 templates that we talked about. So start with the templates, improve upon those templates in case they're really not as strong as they could be. And then here's a couple more. So we touched on these a little bit, the blocking of legacy authentication. When I talked about Intune, I touched on the idea of requiring compliant devices and app protection policies. So these are some of the ones that Trimarc recommends. We obviously have a handful more that we do like to recommend. I'm going to save those to just remain in our report for now, though. And so that really picks us up from those first 5 that Scott brought us in through. And now we're all the way up to 8. So we've now secured our multi-factor authentication policies, risk-based policies. I'm going to count those extra 3 that I gave you. So with that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move into kind of our third pillar here. and this is going to be the insecure defaults section. And this, I didn't know what to put here, so I asked AI, and AI came up with some pretty interesting photos. The photo on the right was pretty good. It says, whoops, forgot to change the defaults. So if you've used AI at all for whatever reason, even if you tell it exactly how to spell a word, the photograph can't spell the word. And then the one on the left, I have no idea why that's insecure, but there's a guy that's like a half bat and a half human, and they're in a computer, so I don't know. So Scott, why don't you give me a quick break so I can drink my water here, and tell me a little bit about some of the insecure defaults for on-prem Active Directory.
I think the nice thing to say real quick, Brandon, is that at least this shows that AI is not going to take over our jobs just yet.
Yeah, apparently.
We have a little more time. All right, so on-prem insecure defaults. Should probably come as no surprise, but on-prem AD does not come with the best, most secure configurations out of the box. I will say in Microsoft's defense, on-prem AD has been around for over 20 years now, which is impressive. And it is really fantastic for backwards compatibility, and most of the time, it just works. I won't say it's set it and forget it, but it's darn near bulletproof. But some of the defaults have not aged well and really need to be updated if you want to have any shot at securing your AD environment. So first up, let's start with some user rights assignments. We still see this one from time to time. Remove the authenticated users group from the domain controller's group policy object setting, add workstations to the domain, and replace that with the administrators group or a custom group like workstation admins. There is the curb relay up attack that abuses this default configuration, and it's not one you need. It's not an ability your authenticated users need. Outside of that, it's really limiting which groups have rights to log into your domain controller, as well as manage different aspects of the DCs and Active Directory itself. So this includes really just removing server operators from everything. It's a group we don't want to see any membership in, and we don't want to see any rights in, because really server operators is just, at least out of the box, is basically having rights to administer domain controllers. And really we want that reserved for your actual administrators. From there, take away print operators' ability to load and unload device drivers. There's definitely some attack paths related to updating those if an attacker could get membership in that group, as well as removing backup operators' ability to log in and shut down domain controllers. They don't need to be doing either of those things. And then next up, let's talk print spooler. The best advice really here is just disable it everywhere and anywhere it is not in use. If it is used on domain controllers in your environment, maybe you're one of the 100 environments that we look at on a yearly basis that is doing print pruning. I'm sorry to say that feature just needs to go away, and you need to disable the print spooler service anyway. It's just too vulnerable. But I am happy to report, as the years have gone by, we're seeing this happen more and more in the environments we assess. This used to be one of the most common critical findings we saw in AD Forest, but we see it a lot less these days, which is fantastic. It does show that we can have an impact and a positive impact on security. All right, moving into protocols.
Maybe. There we go.
There we go. It's the big-eyed cat that was bringing it down.
I'm blaming Danny.
This one is a bit tricky, as there is an unknown element to these protocols and configurations. Is it being used? Is it not being used? And coming from me and Brandon both coming from administrative backgrounds, we know you get very little praise for making the environment more secure, but you get a ton of grief if you break something in the process. So really around these configurations, I'm going to advocate for auditing. Auditing is your friend, and you need to implement it before you decide to ban anything outright in your environments. But I will say that there are less and less systems and applications that are unable to support these newer protocols and configurations. So I'm not saying, it's just going to work in your environments, but I'm saying, there's probably a fair amount of environments that could implement this without any negative impact. And passwords. I know this is one of Brandon's favorite subjects. I've talked about it in the past as well too. This is likely the most contentious item on the list. If you're ever looking to pick a fight at an IT security conference, take a stance on password policy requirements. However, we believe it's reasonable to set a 12-character default domain password policy requirement with stronger requirements for your administrative and your service accounts. So fine-grained password policies is a great way to target those more sensitive objects in your environment. And I'm going to say what I think is the single best thing you can do to really strengthen passwords in your environment is really implementing a password filter solution like the one available through Entra. It'll flag known bad passwords. You can implement your own custom banned password list. It really is great and does cut down on the ability for a lot of the password attack methods that are out there today. And again, if you don't like what I have said around passwords, my name is Brandon Colley. Happy to see you at any of the IT conferences that we sponsor.
I didn't know you did that. Thank you.
All right. So while Entra has not been around nearly as long as on-prem, it still suffers from the same challenges of insecure defaults. So let's switch back over and take a look at what those configurations are and how you should go about mitigating those. Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, thank you, Scott. And if I get any of this wrong, my name is Scott. So, so as far as Entra ID and secure defaults go, like Active Directory, like you just heard, there's a good number of these. So I've kind of wanted to split these into just a couple different subsections per se. So first, I want to cover things that are going to impact the entire tenant. And then next, we're going to talk about some of the user settings. So these aren't necessarily settings on specific user accounts. So they're also very similar, if in some cases the exact same as tenant settings as they impact all users in the tenant. They're also all on the same GUI page, so it's easy to show you just one nice big screenshot. Then the application consent. So this is discussion around the ability for users to allow applications access in the environment and why this might still be dangerous. And then finally, we're going to talk external sharing as well as the access. So here we're going to pick on things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, Skype. So first up are the tenant settings. So this git msol command, this has been around for a long time. And as you may be aware, Microsoft's been shifting to Graph for quite some time now. So these policies are a little bit fewer than they were once upon a time, but still some interesting stuff here. And as you can see there in the bottom, that msol company settings, that still works for even for some of the settings that used to exist in this. You can't see them anymore, but you can still set them. So I don't know, PowerShell does what it wants. So a couple of the ones in here, I realize the screenshot may be a little bit difficult to see, but that first one is users' ability to create security groups. So this also appears in the user settings and by default is allowed. Also the LOB or the line of business applications, that's another one that's also in the user settings. I've recently learned that that's shifted over there. So this is the users can register applications. And then one that hasn't appeared in the GUI yet, I'll say, is the ability for users to read other users. And so the vulnerability around this one is mostly around reconnaissance techniques. So if an adversary gets just a single user account, they can start poking around and seeing things and doing things. And so Trimarc recommends that we turn this off if you can. We do realize that this may cause problems. And I posed to Scott the question earlier. It's, if we turn this off in Active Directory, what do you think would happen?
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it's a really cool feature if you're able to pull it off. I mean, for our on-prem Active Directory security assessment, I mean, what, 90% of the data that we collect and write our reports on and, find our findings and attack paths is really just done as a normal domain user. So it's the reconnaissance, but it's amazing what all you can discover in on-prem. So having the ability to turn this off in Entra, I can only imagine would really cut down, on the ability for an attacker just to get that foothold and then escalate from there. I think it would make it a lot more difficult.
Yeah, and we've been recommending this for some time. And, at first we thought this was kind of a big ask, kind of a more difficult option to do. But we have seen some of our repeat customers have the ability to do this. And a lot of the problems we think maybe come from custom apps, less than kind of your Outlook and Teams enumeration techniques that may be out there, or maybe built in to be required for a tenant. So beyond the tenant settings, the user settings, I talked about that first one, the user's ability to register applications. So that is a default. And now that I think about it, literally every single thing on this screenshot, everything in this page is an insecure default. So register applications, that should be shifted. The next one, change it the other way, change it the other way. So you need to literally click everything on the screen. Restricting non-admins from creating tenants. So that's another one on there. The user's ability to create security groups from the last screen. That could also be a dangerous default setting. The guest settings was recently moved from its own guest blade and is now in the user settings too. This finally by default is not the most inclusive, but it's also not the most restrictive. So I've noticed that Microsoft seemingly started giving us some of those settings. So it's not on or off, it's kind of in between. So that's nice, it could be better. Restricting access to the Entra admin center. I think there was a question when we covered this a little bit in conditional access from the chat too. So you can disable the abilities, all users' ability to access the admin panel from here. However, that's not going to protect everything. So you can still perform some of the queries. You could still use some of the graph. You could use some of the PowerShell to access some of the data as a regular user that you might find in the admin center. So a better way of doing that is to actually use a conditional access policy, and not only just to enforce MFA for admins that are accessing it, but to block anyone else that should not be there. So you can do that in a conditional access policy. And then lastly is just the ability to link LinkedIn accounts for whatever reason seems like a great idea for a lot of tenants. So that's on by default as well. And that's one that you can limit and create a group if that is a requirement for your tenant. So application consent. This one's a super busy slide. This is really wordy. So I apologize if it's difficult to see, but this is also by default allows users to consent to applications. So for this one, you should at least require verified publishers. And I'll throw, there's a screenshot on the next slide I'll show you. So I'll come back to that here in a second as to why you maybe don't want to full-blown allow users to consent to any app that they want to. I will say that first little warning thing, that's from Microsoft that states that even they recommend against their own default configuration. So maybe pop that up a little bit.
If only they knew the people to talk to change it, huh, Brandon?
I don't know. Maybe it's hard coded. The other little little yellow warning light in there states that in March of this year, the group owner consent setting is going to be changed. And so if you all haven't checked your watches or calendar, it's April now. And I went back and I looked at the screenshot, and so they have changed it. It doesn't say that in March it's going to change, it now says that in April it's going to change. So regardless of if it's called the team owner or the group owner, chances are it's still going to be an insecure default. So go ahead and change that setting to restrict group owners to consent for only selected groups if you can't go all the way to not allowing it at all. And some of the reasons that consent to applications is a problem is we just did a quick Google search for malicious OAuth client apps in Office, and there's thousands of examples, and all of this stuff is still out there. So granting the users or protecting your users by preventing what they can and can't consent to and requiring administrative approval on some things is going to be a fantastic win.
Yeah, and really, I mean, allowing users to download from the verified publishers probably should take care of, the vast majority of users, and then just implementing a workflow, for those exceptions, those one-offs that require administrative approval.
Right.
Shouldn't be too big of a deal.
Yeah, and I kind of equate that just to like being able to install things from the Microsoft Store, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's instead of just going and downloading your own version of 7-zip, just install it from the store. It's okay, we've got it, right? Last insecure default topic is we're going to pick on the external sharing. This, for whatever reason, I feel like is a semi-famous screenshot because this is the only thing I've seen that has those scrolly bars, which is funny because they're all the way at the top, which says most permissive, whereas they should be closer to the bottom, which is least permissive. So the ability to share your external content with anyone and to not even require sign-in is going to be obviously a little bit more of a vehicle for data extraction or sensitive data being lost from your tenant. And so obviously shifting that down is a little bit better. In addition to those cute slide bars, you've got a drop-down list underneath there that you can select, and you can identify a couple more settings in here. So allowing guests to share items they don't own, that just sounds ridiculous and dangerous. Guest access expiration dates are going to be good to enforce, and the same with reauthentication. So just allowing there to be some sort of a time frame where some of the sharing can be limited. And then I think probably one of my favorite ones in this is the default sharing links is always going to be set to edit unless you change this to view. So what this does is prevents the users from accidentally just copying the link, sharing it with somebody, and now they automatically have the ability to edit that data. It doesn't say that you can't provide that ability. It's just that extra step to, when you share the document, to be able to select, okay, I want Scott to edit it, instead of just everyone being able to edit it when you share that. And so that's it for the SharePoint and the OneDrive settings. And I also wanted to include this. I lumped this in for the external access piece, and this is the configuration in the Teams portal to administer Teams. Sorry, Teams and Skype external access. So if you haven't seen this before, I thought that they changed this because this created quite a buzz. I don't know, 8 months ago-ish. I'm not good with timing, but so I believe brand new tenants maybe have this turned off by default, but existing tenants probably still have this enabled by default, where anybody from an external tenant with a Teams account, even if they're not associated with an organization, can communicate with members of your tenant. So it can go one way or the other. And sorry, same is true with Teams and Skype. And so limiting this is going to be a great option to do. From here, you can obviously block all external domains. It's going to be your best. This is another opportunity to provide whitelisting for domains that you know that you do work with. You can also block specific domains, which is going to be not quite as good. because then you're kind of just chasing the adversaries. And I used to think that this setting is primarily due to social engineering and phishing, and just anyone with a Skype account can message anyone else with a Skype account and say, hey, check out this link or whatever. But it's more than that. So at the bottom here is a link to an article that I wrote last year that talks about how some of these settings enable external enumeration to occur. And so you may be putting a little bit more information out there to the world than you maybe are aware. And so with that wraps up our insecure defaults section. And so that adds 9 and 10 to our top 10 list, the default settings for the tenant as well as the user. But in typical Trimarc fashion, we don't limit ourselves to 10 because we like to do more. And so we've got 11 and 12. Added both the default application consent as well as the external sharing and access. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end, and we almost hit time exactly, but we're gonna leave time for questions to flow in. I know Danny's been collecting questions along the way. You can go ahead and continue to post those and stick around if you can or want to. Scott and I will stay for a little while to answer questions live. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and you can see a lot of our details. You can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on LinkedIn, you can email us. Our Linktree has everything that you need to access Trimarc, but I will let Danny say all of that stuff since this is his slide.
Stealing the thunder.
You literally just already said it. There's nothing left for me to Danny repeat the things that I just said. No, well, so there's a whole list of questions, so I have them in our chat. If you have any there that you want to pick out, we do have a few minutes to go over a couple of them. There was one, can you share that link? The last blog referenced, yes, it's in chat, but I'll do it again. It's the enumerating Entra ID, in case Joe's still listening. Entra ID anonymously, I will share that again. But yeah, go ahead and pick out any question in there that you want to answer.
There was one from earlier, unless Scott has one.
I see a couple here that we have flags regarding to the multi-factor authentication for admins accessing Microsoft admin portals, CA policy. Would this configuration be redundant if you already have PIM in place for those privileged roles? So I can see it being redundant if you also want PIM to require an additional MFA.
It seems like, so I think that's, maybe I failed to mention that that's probably a great starting point as far as requiring administrators to use MFA when accessing admin portals. I would recommend not necessarily limiting the application to just admin portals. It should be pretty much all apps. So yes, if you do have a separate policy in place, that would be a redundant policy. So you don't need to necessarily go in and implement all 17 conditional access policy templates. I would actually advise against doing that. Be a little bit more intentional and broad with some of those policy settings. It looks like there was one right before that too about the impact of report-only policies. The question was, what's the best way to view the impact of a report-only policy? Is there a chart or graph somewhere? So that's a great question. I know that that pretty graph that I showed, that was part of the Microsoft managed accounts. So that Microsoft managed policies, sorry, that's available for those. It doesn't look exactly like that for report only. Some of the things that I know that I've done in the past in evaluating that is going in and look through the sign-in logs. So when you're testing policies that are in report only mode, it's going to show on the specific sign-ins that occur. You can click through conditional access policies that apply during that sign-in, and it'll show you the ones that are in report only mode. So you'll know whether or not that policy was triggered during specific signing events and which policies were not triggered during signing events.
I think this might be one of my favorite questions, Brandon. I'm having a real am I the baddie moment with the hate for nested groups. Does the concern extend beyond the level 0, 1 groups to things like having job role group members of groups that grant access to systems? And also says, thanks so much. This has been super helpful and thought-provoking.
So I'm thinking this is the role assignable groups, as we call it, granting access to systems. We've been seeing a lot more of that recently, and I think the primary concern with it right now that I've got is the ownership. So roles don't have owners, but groups do. And if you have a role assignable group that has a non-administrative owner, it gives them the ability to modify the security group. Same is true for like group administrators, although role assignable groups are protected in certain ways from just typical group administration. It just creates an avenue, an extra delegation, like Scott had talked about in the first section. I think that's one of the biggest things for me around that, especially when we talk about the tier 0 or the level 0 groups. I don't know that your global admins are going to be changing frequent enough that it makes sense to manage a group instead of managing the role itself.
And I think it's easier to track, right? It's easier. Hey, I'm going to look at the global administrators group and to see what members are in that group. And then if you have another group nested in there, that's something else you have to factor in. And some of this is what I'll call PTSD from the on-prem side, right? Where we assess these environments, they have hundreds of domain admins, and it's because, they put a group within domain admins and another group within that group that's in domain admins. And so they're adding accounts to this group, not knowing, the full level of access this group is being granted because of, the nesting that came from it. So it's really just those highly privileged groups and roles that we're most concerned about, because those are the ones we want to be the easiest to track and for people not to forget. Because part of it's just a handoff over the years, right? You create this role assignable group, assign it to global admins. 5 years later, you leave, somebody else comes in, and maybe it's it's been forgotten what this role assignable group is for. Maybe it's titled security admins. So they're like, oh, new security admin, let's add it to this group. So that's just what we see. It's not inherently bad. It's just over time, it just seems to drift.
All right, that's awesome. We are well over our time, and we do have a lot of other questions that we would love to get to. But as I said in the chat, we're gonna make a blog out of it. We're gonna answer, we don't like to leave questions unanswered. So by the way, if you have signed up for this and you want to share it with your team, you'll either get a notification from GoToWebinar, or it ends up on our YouTube. It'll end up on hub.trimarcsecurity.com. You're going to be able to share this. I normally try to be extra and say, it'll be up by tomorrow. Give me a week. Give me a week for the downloading and editing and all that fancy stuff. But yes, you'll be able to share it with your entire team. We encourage it. And we thank everybody for joining. And then, yes, that last slide there, you can visit our link tree. We do a ton of stuff. We're going to be at CypherCon this weekend. We are sponsors for B-Sides Charm in Maryland, and then we'll also be at B-Sides Dublin. We'll be at Wild West Hacking Fest. We'll be at all these different places all over the place. So come and talk to us. The cool part about when you come to our events, there's no salespeople. You have Brandon there, you have Scott there, you have Sean there. You talk to the actual experts in this stuff. You're not getting pitched. You're not getting any of that. We just want to talk because we want to nerd out with you. So we do appreciate everybody for joining us. We're going to have another webcast here in a couple of months with Jake Hildreth. I don't know if he knows that yet or not, but for myself, for Scott, for Brandon, thank you everybody for being here this entire time. I really appreciate it. And we'll catch everybody next time.